I'm Nick Kaklowski. I'm a senior research director at IONS. I'm in charge of a lot of our management and leadership, GRC, and privacy content, which means I also do a lot of our content focused on helping CISOs. This is Steve Martano. He's an IONS faculty member and a partner at Artico Search's cybersecurity practice. Steve, why don't you provide a little bit of an intro?
Sure, great to see everybody today. Thanks for taking the early bird session with us. Know for especially you West Coasters, maybe not the easiest time to wake up after probably a late night. But great to be here. I'm Steve Martano, as Nick mentioned. I've been on the IONS faculty since last year, but really been partnering with IONS for the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years. I've been in executive recruiting and specifically cyber recruiting since 2013. I'm a partner at Artico Search now and previously worked at Russell Reynolds, Caldwell Partners, some of the bigger firms that you may know. I spend all of my time talking to security people, security leaders, CISOs, and their teams. We work on searches for Fortune 500 organizations, private equity, venture capital, and we've really been on the ground floor as this function has evolved from security to really business and technical risk. And so today we'll be talking a little bit about our 2023 survey results and talk a little bit about what's going on in 24 and what to expect on the future of some of this data and the trends and really how to do more with less and how to take the environment where resource stricken, budgets are getting tighter, but expectations both from threat management standpoint, regulatory standpoint, leadership and liability standpoint are really increasing. So that's what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, so every year since 2020, IONS and Artico have partnered on a survey of CISOs, and last year we expanded it out to their teams on their compensation, their budgets, their satisfaction with the role, the dynamics of their leadership team. Last year we had 660 respondents, so we're going to pull from that data to talk about really what we're seeing about the state of the role right now. But these are very conversational sessions that we like to do, so if you have questions throughout, just come up to the mic and ask your question in the middle. Don't feel like you need to wait till the last 10 minutes to ask something. We'd rather hear from you and get a sense of what you care about, and we can expand and contract in different areas of the presentation based on where you want to see us go, so don't hesitate to come up to the mic and talk. And with that, let's get to business. So, disclaimer, we've all seen those at RSA. What we are seeing at a high level is a market where the expectations around the CISO role are transforming from a tech leadership role into more of a business risk executive role. The tech leadership is still there, but the business risk leadership and business risk ownership is increasingly a huge part of what the CISO is doing, to a point where we're actually seeing a lot of CISOs being asked to own elements of risk that aren't really in their direct sphere of control, and it's putting CISOs in a tricky spot. Steve, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit as we get this going?
Yeah, I want to take a step back and think about how this function has evolved over the last 10 years. We are probably in year 9 or 10 of a 30-year journey, 25-year journey. And we are all at the points of our career where we've been through this and we're in the middle of this arc. And so when we think about the transformative security function, rather than thinking about mostly technical, mostly back office, mostly cost center, the function has been elevated. This is now an executive function. You hear about it in quarterly earnings calls. Investors care about it when they're going through due diligence processes more than they were 10 years ago. And consequently, your job hasn't gotten any easier. The visibility has increased, but the job's gotten much more difficult. And so we see this all come into play with all these points here. Direct lines of communication to the board, more visibility, more softer skills, more focus on softer skills and influencing and driving relationships cross-functionally, because to Nick's point, now you have security teams that are working cross-functionally, they're working with other teams, and you have CISOs who are responsible for things that are not in their sphere of influence, and it's more of sphere of influence rather than direct responsibility. So that's what we're discussing here. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and all of this is happening at a time when businesses are accelerating their digitization processes and really having to deal with resource tightening across the industry. So the challenge is real. We're all feeling the pain. And we're seeing a lot of growing pains. We're going to start off talking a little bit about how we see the CISO typically regarded in the org. So I'm going to be your kind of data person. Steve's going to talk about what it really means. What we ask in our survey is for CISOs to tell us basically how they are regarded within the business relative to org rank in the org chart. So basically how many layers they are away from the C-suite. We found about only 20% of CISOs are at the C-level. I want to draw your attention to our split of mid-sized firm C-level folks and 1 billion plus C-level folks, because really it's two distinct cohorts. And what we see is if someone thinks of themselves or is regarded as C-level, but they're in a mid-sized firm, it's generally because the management team isn't particularly mature. It's a relatively light, thin management team. And so they're working hand in glove with the CEO, with the CFO, and they're running every single aspect of security, and it's a huge job in terms of scope. but it's still relatively focused on tech leadership. Whereas when we look at the 1 billion plus CISOs who are considered C-level, they are dealing with a very mature management team, and that job is very political, it's very relationship management, it's very influence driven. But most CISOs we see sitting at the VP or executive level, and then we've got that contingent at the director level. Steve, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, two things strike me when looking at this chart. One is on the positive side. If we were to take this chart from 5 years ago, it would look drastically different. You would have very few security leaders at the C level. You'd have some at the VP level, most at the director level, and even many below that. That's encouraging that we've made strides. What's discouraging is it hasn't happened fast enough compared to the threat environment, the regulatory landscape, and the liability concerns. And so we're trending in the right direction, but it's going to take time. I also look at this and I think, okay, so if the CISO is being elevated, then teams are hopefully being elevated, compensation is following, and instead of a role that was an individual contributor, back office engineer, now you have a team responsible for all of security engineering. Maybe that gets you a director title, and you can actually see a progression path in front of you that gets you to the leadership and executive ranks.
Great, and just a reminder, folks, if you have any questions on this, feel free to come up to the mic throughout the presentation. Don't feel like you need to wait till the end, or just raise your hand and talk loudly, and we'll try to get to you. All right, so as we see the CISO role evolving, we are seeing scope creep continue dramatically each year. And I want to draw attention to some of those areas at the bottom of the chart, from product security down through fraud, where we've seen all of those categories become more prominent parts of the CISO role in the past couple of years. And this is where you really see that difference between like what the 1 billion plus firm size C-level folks are doing versus the C-level folks that are more mid-sized firms, where the 1 billion plus firms are being brought into things that are direct line of business, like AppSec, product security, fraud, whereas the mid-sized C-level firms are just being brought into everything that's relatively new for security to own. They have to take over. Those mid-sized folks have a tough job. Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I want to do a little bit of an informal poll. So raise your hand if you've been at your company for over a year. Keep your hand raised if your scope has been the same over that time. Okay, there you go. No hands are raised, right? So we went from 75% people have been in their role for over a year. The scope has changed, sometimes dramatically. Sometimes to a point where you look back at the job description that you signed an offer letter, and it doesn't look anything like what you're doing today. And that could be a positive thing. That could be part of a promotion track. That could be part of expansion of duty because you're doing really well. That could be project driven, all these different things. But to the point, scope creep is real. It's real in this function, and it can be daunting, and it can be frustrating, and it can be difficult. And we're trying to navigate this together of how do you design a really robust security organization, and how do you keep it aligned with a framework that you could fall back to, whether it's NICE, NIST, whatever that is. At least there's a justification for this is here because, and this is there because. So that's what we're trying to ascertain out of this data as well.
And Steve, let's say you're talking to somebody who's been in their role for a couple of years and they've seen scope creep, and they're starting to feel like the org hasn't recognized their work, but they don't want to necessarily jump into a new org. How do they manage the relationships so that they can start getting, whether it's an in-house promotion, whether it's retention bonuses, to think about using their in-house influence to grow their careers without necessarily changing jobs?
Yeah, and I think this is an important point, particularly in an environment where most people that I talk to, I would say 75% plus, are open to something different, but they're not finding that right next role quite yet, whether it's macro instability or a soft job market, layoffs in the tech sector, whatever the case may be. This is where the soft skills really come into play, because it's the relationships and the influence and really building a foundation and taking what you have in an organization and taking the data, third-party data, frameworks, and going to somebody in your leadership team, your hiring manager, your CISO, your direct manager, whoever that may be, and saying, listen, we're struggling to deliver, we're struggling to prioritize. I just want to take a step back and think about, what am I doing in my day-to-day work? How does that align with the mission of what I should be doing as a team leader, as an individual contributor? And just making sure that expectations are out there. And there are always going to be frustrations. And I think that many of us suffer from, well, this is a high performer, so I'm going to give them a really difficult task and a really difficult project to navigate through and problem solve. And that's great. That's a testament to who you are as a worker and an individual and a problem solver. But that also can cause friction and can cause a lot of stress.
Yeah, I think another thing we should probably touch on this slide is a lot of these more emerging functions that I think about, like privacy, physical security, fraud, are areas that security we see co-owning with other teams. But as more digital tools are emerging, especially we see this with AI, security is being asked to actually full-on own risk decisions that really need to be owned by other lines of business, that security doesn't necessarily have the jurisdiction to make that decision. And we see a lot of CISOs feel like they're out on an island having to make choices without the support of the business. Steve, how do you recommend folks kind of manage that setup of who controls what, where the CISO is full-on owning decisions versus where the CISO needs to be able to be a confidant and resource for the person who owns the decision?
This can be really murky. And so, again, we go back to relationship building, communication, prioritization, but really also thinking about where your business is going as well. Is what you're doing in alignment with the business goals? We're working on a consulting project right now with a West Coast utility company, and we're doing a survey of satisfaction and trying to understand what some of the pain points are, be it via people or technology or whatever the case may be. And it's really, what I ask people is, do you understand what the security priorities and goals are? Do you feel that your role is aligned with those priorities and goals? That's step one, because that's in your vertical. And then secondarily, do you have an understanding of where the business is going? And does that align with the security strategy that's being articulated to you? And this is a really, there's a bottoms-up approach to this, too. Here's what I'm working on today, here's how I think it's aligned with security, and here's why security is important to the business. There's also a top-down approach as well, where it's the CISO and the leadership saying, here's what we're doing from a company perspective, here's how it matters to security, and then your hiring manager translating that into your daily tasks. But asking those questions and becoming more sophisticated about your business will actually help enable you be a better security leader and a better security practitioner in whatever capacity you're working on today.
Yeah, folks have any questions or comments about this so far? Go ahead.
Can you comment about the CISO being the office of no and the trend to be supported confidant?
All right, so the question was, can we talk about the CISO going from being the office of no toward becoming a trusted confidant? Steve, want to go ahead?
Yeah, there's a very fine line here, right? Because if you have a security department that is just saying yes to everything, then what value are you necessarily bringing? There are times where security needs to be a guardrail, but security really needs to understand the priorities of the business. And so you may have an earlier stage company that if it doesn't exist in 12 months, then that's not good for anybody, and they're trying to get product out the door, but there have to be some safeguards there because you're putting code out into the market, and your customers are going to be asked about that. So some of it is internal. It's what do we value from a security perspective? How do we think about security? How does that fit into our broader product strategic roadmap? But some of it is external too, because if you're serving public companies, they have requirements that you're going to have to work on. They're going to have questionnaires that you're going to have to fulfill. And so this is the give and take, and this is a really difficult thing to navigate as a security leader and any security practitioner, is what's the right level of security? What's the right balance of all of this? And that's a conversation that is typically top down, but the information security leader has to have a voice in that room, and it can't just always be the no person, it can't just always be the yes person. It's very blurry in between, and it doesn't make anybody's job easy, but that's where judgment and business acumen really come into play.
Yeah, any other questions, comments? We'll keep moving, but if I missed you, we'll get you later. So as we think about finding that organizational alignment, what we see is a very strong tie between board reporting and CISOs being satisfied with how the org is moving in terms of security. Our data shows that about 50% of CISOs report to the board at least quarterly. And when we look at those folks who report to the board at least quarterly, the vast majority of them are happy with the C-suite's handling of the security budget requests, and they agree that the security budget aligns with business mandates and security alignment. Whereas we go to people who don't report to the board at all, and it's a complete reversal shift. Steve, can you speak a bit to why we think we see CISOs who report to the board feeling more satisfied and aligned with the organization?
Yeah, I mean, everybody likes to go to board meetings in Cancun, right? Okay, so that's part of it. But secondarily, right, this just shows an alignment and an understanding that the business is hearing security and security is hearing the business needs. And so those who are insulated from that, the CISOs that I talk to that are most frustrated say to me, I'm not getting through to senior leaders of the board because everything that I'm creating from a content standpoint is being sanitized. And maybe we've all experienced that, or some of us have experienced that to some degree. And so how do you break through? Because this is pretty clear. And out of our data, we have a hiring and retention report that we send to our talent partners and we send to boards and CEOs that are looking to hire a new CISO, or they say, what's going on in the market? How can we just do what we can to mitigate the risk of changing CISOs? We know that there's a good amount of transience in this function. It's about visibility, it's about alignment and communication. And that's what we're seeing in this data. It's that those people who have that visibility, those people who have that influence, the board members can go to them and ask really now detailed questions. It's not just the perfunctory, are we secure? Yeah, we're secure enough, okay, move on. Despite this, however, we still see that security is at the end of the board meeting and the time gets shortened. So getting the message crisp and as complete as you can in that amount of time is really important and really challenging.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting, let's just be real here, if you're a CISO who's not reporting to the board, you probably feel pretty stuck because you're not going to be able to just say, hey, I should be in the next board meeting and get a written invite to the next board meeting. Steve, what do folks, like, you're not going to be able to shift your organization's board policies overnight. What kind of relationship should folks be building? How should they be managing those internal politics to show that they need a seat at the board and that it's valuable to the business for them to be there?
Yeah, and these are lessons for CISOs, but also at all levels. It's finding the advocates for your function and finding the people who will be advancing your agenda and understand what your goals are as a security practitioner to advance the conversation even when you're not in the room. And without doing that, without getting the buy-in of your cross-functional peer group, or those who have influence in the organization, getting up to this level will be impossible. So you have to start this grassroots campaign and going after people that you think have an affinity to security, have an interest in security. You can take what's going on at a macro level, distill it down to what's going on to your company, and say to somebody who's non-technical, or you go to a CFO, or you go to a general counsel, or one of the assistant general counsels, or a product person, and you say, hey, I was just reading about this article and this threat, and here's how I think it affects our company, and we should be thinking about it, and we should be talking about it. Based on those informal dialogues and discussions and lunches and coffees around the office, particularly as we get more into a hybrid model and we're spending more time together, you can identify those champions and they can help advance your brand internally and the brand of the security program.
Yeah, any other questions and comments on this? Okay, go ahead.
Can you speak to the things like cyber, get my notes here, sorry, the cyber scorecard for cyber resilience that's come into vogue lately, thanks to Harvard Business Review last year, where certain CISOs are getting asked to condense all of your presentation down to like one slide, and is like the value of that and what the pendulum swing looks like in that?
Yeah, well, we haven't found an equilibrium here on what's too much versus not enough. But I would say taking the level a little bit higher and saying, look, you know, a CFO can talk about GAAP accounting until they're blue in the face, but that's not what the board cares about. And a general counsel can talk about case law until they're blue in the face, but that's not what the board cares about. So coming up with those high-level themes and metrics, I mean, some of it will be dictated by outside authorities, or there'll be guidelines, or there'll be suggestions or recommendations, but we haven't quite got there yet. And also, this is a function where the needs of one organization vastly differ than the needs of another. And so if you're a retail organization where your biggest concern is PCI, very different than a hospital network, where you have HIPAA regulations and you have really sensitive data going across your network. So it's, over time, we'll find that right cadence and that equilibrium. But when I look at this, I mean, there's still a lot of information security leaders that aren't even getting those reps yet. So we have to get that number higher. And then as we do that, figure out what the right information is, what's too much versus not enough. And that's only going to happen through a dialectic too. But I think that the boards are getting smarter as well. I did an NACD masterclass last year saying, okay, your expectation is that your CISO is going to elevate and have those strategic conversations. What are you doing from a board to empower that person to get those business skills, particularly somebody who's come up the technical track? Because as we've seen in our data, 70% of CISOs have come up through engineering or operations or some sort of technical track rather than the business side. So that's an important distinction as well, is we were expecting CISOs to go up, but we also have to have boards that are open to these conversations and open to training and open to helping everybody scale. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, and I would say what we've seen at a high level from a lot of CISOs in our community who have been doing board reporting now for years is pick a framework that works and aligns with what your business is trying to do, explain and get the board on board with why you're using that framework, have a third party assess your maturity relative to that framework and have a starting point of this is where we're at, and then say based on where our business is going, our goals are to improve our scores in this framework to Y destination, and then each quarter you're reporting, okay, we moved the needle this far on these areas, here's what's working, here's what's not, and now you're showing maturation and progress to the board in a way that they can understand because they're on board with the way you're delivering that. and they don't need to see, oh, we reduced the number of incidents getting through by X hundred amounts or whatever. That's not going to mean anything. We can say we've changed our score here from an independent audit of 5.3 to 5.5. We've gotten better. That's meaningful. Here's what that really means, and you can kind of tell that narrative. Any other questions? All right. We're going to shift a bit and talk about what we're seeing in terms of budget trends. So as we see the scope increasing, CISOs and their teams have more to do. How are we going to get by doing it with less? Because what we are seeing is the past couple of years, budgets have increased consistently in double-digit pace. This year, they increased on average by 6%. Some of what we're seeing is there are simply fewer orgs that are having huge budget shifts. The whole, we haven't invested in cybersecurity in the past decade, we need to launch a new program, our budget's growing by 150%. That used to happen a handful of times every year of the survey. Very rarely that happened last year. But we're also seeing general tightening and macroeconomic pressure on budgets. Steve, want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that we started to see this trend in Q4 of 2022, where people went through the summer expecting a budget to be whatever percentage, 15%, 20% over what it was the previous year, and then it got ratcheted down, and then it got ratcheted down again, and then 6 months later it got ratcheted down again. Hey, the whole organization's lopping off another 1-2%, and you're no exception. And so this has been what we've seen from the end of 22 until now. I'm hopeful that when we get to Q4 2024, we see this tick up again and we find a more normalized market from a macro standpoint. But this is the reality of what we're living in today. And I think anybody in this room who's running a budget has probably experienced some of this.
It's also worth noting we've seen tech budgets getting slashed and a lot of parts of the business facing real budget decline. So the fact that security is still consistently getting something of an increase in budget is nice. It's showing this isn't a situation where businesses are saying, yeah, we don't care about security anymore. It's not a priority. They're simply saying we can only do so much.
Right.
But that's putting teams in a hard spot.
Yeah, and I had lunch with a Fortune 50 CISO yesterday who said, we're just cutting like crazy in tech. We're still hiring in security. And I said, okay, talk about your hiring. How's it going? He said, not great, because the compensation is misaligned with the market and there's not a whole lot of movement because of what's going on at the macro perspective and what's going on in the organization. And so even when it is, we're trying to scale, are you actually scaling? So there's some of that going on out there as well. Question? Yep.
Have you seen any correlation to the budget cuts to the trend to cloud from on-prem, being that that's supposed to reduce?
So the question was, have we seen a correlation in budget cuts and the trend to cloud and versus on-prem? We generally see total cost of ownership of cloud over the years is typically higher than on-prem. And I would say percentage of security budget as a percentage of IT budget increases dramatically when folks have moved on to the cloud. Steve, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's right. Also, every company buckets these differently. I was talking to a CISO of an international conglomerate last week, and he was saying our IT budget is all the cloud budget, and the security pieces are pulled from that budget. So how do you think about that in the context of this data? It's a little bit difficult because what we're doing is we're going to CISOs and we're asking them for their budgetary data and how it's broken down. But to Nick's point, I mean, the transformation to the cloud is real, it's here, it's happening, and every organization is allocating budget to that in a little bit of a different way.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think Steve gave us a really natural segue to start talking about how budget plays out in staff. So the past couple of years, we've seen security have a lot of room to hire. That declined significantly last year. Steve, can you talk about the pressures of finding staff? And our next slide, we'll get into some staff compensation data, so we'll go deeper here.
Yeah, I mean, I think despite all the layoffs that we hear about and we've seen, and maybe we've experienced or have had friends or contacts who've experienced this, it's still really difficult to hire for really competent people who can hit the ground running in these organizations. And we have clients who say, we opened this up on LinkedIn, we had 1,500 applicants, we're good. And it's, well, there might be 10 people or 20 people that are really qualified to do this job, but how do you get the signal amidst all of that noise? At the same time, we just see that this is the trend that matches budgets overall. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the compensation for staff, and we could jump into that now.
Actually, so before we go into compensation for staff, one other thing we want to mention is just proportionately. We have seen consistently over the past 3 years of doing this research, actually 4 years, that staff and compensation makes up 38% of most security budgets. We still hear pretty consistently from CISOs, we have money for tools. If we really need a tool and it's supporting a business goal, we can generally get money for the tool. Where we can't get enough money, where we can't get enough resources is for staff. So figuring out ways to bump that 38% up, you see it's especially rough in sectors like healthcare where it might be down closer to 30 for hospitals and clinics. Steve, anything you want to add there, or should we just go right into staff?
Yeah,
comp?
I want to make the point that when it's I can't get money for staff, it's okay, we can open up headcount all day long. I mean, that just happens in a vacuum. Okay, you go in a system, you open the headcount, great, that's fine. But the problem occurs when it's HR using incomplete data, incorrect data, whatever the data out there that's in the echo chamber, and it's, I want a security engineer that's focused in the cloud, that's been doing this for 5 years, and I want to pay them a $165,000 salary. Oh, and they're in San Francisco. And it's like, guys, come on, what are you looking at, really? So you have an open headcount, but you're not able to fill it. At the same time, these leaders have sales folks saying, you bought this tool from us, you're using it to 20, 30% of capacity. Well, I have nobody to actually manage it. I have nobody to really take that to its full potential. And yeah, I for some reason, I can get the money for those tools, but I'm not able to hire the analyst to actually leverage that to its utmost potential. And so here's an opportunity to talk about ROI and go back to our business acumen saying, look, if we hire these people at the right level and comp, we can get much more out of these tools and we'll just be a far more efficient organization overall.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit, we'll go forward and then back again. Since we went naturally into this, finding the right comp level for people on your team. This is looking at functional leaders, so head of AppSec, head of architecture, head of GRC, folks who would report directly to the CISO, and normative compensation rates for those folks. So the numbers in the blue bars are the median comp for those roles. Actually, I believe it's average comp for those roles, sorry.
Yep.
And then the orange bars are telling you what the top quartile is. So the middle of the orange bars is the average for the top quartile, and then you've got the floor and the ceiling. And what we see is getting top quartile folks for functional heads is as expensive or slightly more expensive than the average CISO compensation across the industry. And so you'll have a lot of folks come in and say, hey, we need to really ramp up our architecture team. We've had these problems. We need to get a top performer in architecture. But HR is certainly not aware that getting a top performer in architecture, you're talking about more than 500K, getting closer to 550K. Steve, can you unpack how to partner with HR and the other groups within your org to set the right compensation bands for cyber roles?
Yeah, I want to talk about that. Before we do, I want to make note that I get calls from CISOs who, half the CISOs in the market say, these numbers are way too low, I don't know where you're coming up with these numbers. And I have half the market saying, these numbers are way too high, I don't know where you're coming up with these numbers. Well, this is self-reported data from 650 CISOs. So that's what's driving these numbers. And that's across all of market. That's Fortune 50, Fortune 25 organizations, and that's $100 million private equity venture-backed organizations at all different funding scales and levels. To Nick's point, this is really important data to know and understand and bring to leaders to say, look, this is third-party data that's been validated. This has been going on for several years. We have years' worth of data that just tells us this is where the market is. And we have breakdowns for this for financial services or tech-specific or geography, whatever the case may be. But having an understanding of where people are in their compensation, this is going to make a search go much smoother because you really need to be fishing where you can afford the talent that you're trying to get and be realistic about what you can bring in. Now, I wouldn't stand here and say every person that's in the top quartile from a comp standpoint is top quartile in talent, but most of them are. And so being realistic of where do we need to shave a little bit, where can we get a step up, maybe your area of expertise, you don't need a 2.0, you need a supplemental person. That's where you spend, and maybe the area that's your expertise, you could scale somebody up and go on a little more of the junior side, earlier career, somebody who's not quite in that top quartile. But this is really important to understand because you have to know what ponds you're fishing in to go after the right people to run an effective search.
Yeah, question in the back?
What is defined as a functional leader? Is that executive, director, where does that mean?
The question is, how do we define functional leader? We typically look at folks who are reporting directly to the CISO who are running a department, whether they're running architecture, they're running ops, they're running GRC. That's how we kind of define it. Steve, want to clarify anything else there?
Do you want to go back to the chart?
Yeah, we will do
the org
that.
chart will make this clearer.
So as we think about building out the right functional leadership team for the CISO, what we have found is a general progression. So the colors don't quite come in here. The very light gray is telling you that fewer than 25% of CISOs at that org level, at that org size, have that role. The slightly darker gray, lighter blue is 25 to 45%, or 25 to 49, then 50 to 74 for the darkish grayish blue, and then 75 for the navy. So what we're saying here is if you're a $100 million org in terms of revenue, you probably have a 1 to 9 full-time employee team size for security, and then about half of folks in that situation, or 25 to half of folks, are going to have a head of SecOps, head of GRC, head of architecture, and head of product. And fewer than 25% are going to have head of IAM, head of AppSec, and deputy CISO. But as the revenue grows in your business, the need for those roles is going to increase, and you're going to see more and more orgs having those roles. Steve, how do you recommend folks plan to go about using this to think about where their business is going and how that's going to affect the leadership team within security?
Yeah, so first of all, I would point out that this is aggregated data across all sectors and across all industries. So this is going to look a little bit different for a Bay Area tech company compared to a New York financial services company. And you're going to likely have a head of product earlier at a tech company than you would at a bank, and you would likely have a head of GRC earlier at a bank than you would at a product company. So thinking about that and keeping that in mind. But overall, as we look at this graphic, where is your organization going? Where is your organization headed, and how does your resource strategy align with that? Taking an inventory of who do we have today, how do we think about acquisition, how many people do we think will be joining the organization, are we very acquisitive or not acquisitive at all? Are we acquisitive for organizations that are earlier scale that maybe have one person or two people in security that are supplemental help but aren't big teams? Just thinking about, again, back to business acumen, where is your organization going, and how does your resource and staffing strategy align with that, with the overall growth of the business?
Yeah, did that answer your question? All right, and then we have another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, what would you say is the spread between geographies in the salary chart that you were putting up there? What sort of variability is there from top to bottom?
Great, so the question was, what kind of variability in salaries do we see from top to bottom based on geography? Pretty much what you would expect. Northeast and West Coast, we see highest in compensation. Generally speaking, in the Northeast, it's more cash compensation. On the West Coast, it's more equity-based compensation. And then we see variability. Southeast usually comes in next, then Midwest. Steve, you want to unpack a little bit about where people live versus where they work and how that actually matters?
Yeah, so having done this for the last 10 plus years, when I first started recruiting in general in 2010, it was, we are based in Minneapolis, Nashville, Atlanta, New York, San Francisco. We want somebody here. We're willing to relocate, find somebody in the market who can relocate and fully be here. And the expectation, obviously, to be in the office 5 days a week. That's changed dramatically over the last few years. We went from a period of time where it was anybody can be located anywhere. This was the height of the pandemic. We're going to do all our interviews by Zoom, and you could be anywhere. Now we're seeing pretty clearly we're in a hybrid model. We're 3 days in a week. We're 2 days in a week. We don't necessarily need somebody at headquarters, but we want them in a center of mass for our organization. Maybe we're based in San Francisco, but we have an outpost in Denver or Seattle or Austin. Maybe it's New York, but also there's a Tampa location, or we have people in Atlanta, or whatever the case may be. And that makes it a little bit trickier to match from a geography perspective, because your company may be headquartered in New York or San Francisco, but you might be at a place where, okay, we have a technical team in Seattle, right? We break this down by geographies of East, South, Midwest, and West, and we have that data and can parse that data as well to really see those deltas. And it is what you would expect, as Nick said, but by and large, people are now living, if not close to headquarters, then close to a secondary location for their organization.
Yeah, and real quick, if you reach out to us after, we can try to connect you to where we have the actual data. I just don't have it top of mind. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, related question. So do you have any statistics on other areas in the US, like Europe or Asia?
So do we have statistics on other areas besides the US? We do not have Europe or Asia. We just don't have enough respondents. We do have Canada, and folks from Canada, I'm sorry, your market tends to follow European trends, and compensation is dramatically lower than in the US across all roles, including the CISO. Sorry. We have a Canada report specifically coming out for CISOs in about 2 weeks.
We do global searches at my firm. Now, majority of them are U.S. focused, but we've done Canadian searches. We've done searches in the U.K. and Ireland. We've even done searches in Estonia and Czech Republic as well. The reality is that those markets are not as advanced as the U.S. market, just in terms of visibility, in terms of executive leadership, and consequently the compensation matches that.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, we're going to keep moving. So one of the things to think about as you balance out, okay, where can I actually find the right functional leader? Which one's the right one to hire for my role? Is we see that almost half of functional department heads will oversee multiple functions, and that's most common for folks who come in with a SecOps or GRC background. This chart is basically telling you, hey, if I'm a head of SecOps, 30% of the people who are in that role are also running GRC. 48 are also having direct architecture engineering responsibilities, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you get over to architecture, most of them are either just doing architecture or they're involved in AppSec, ProductSec, or identity, which is kind of what we would expect. And intuitively, I think we're all aware of this, wearing multiple hats and who wears which hats in security. But this raw data can kind of help you think about, oh, I need to hire for these two things, but I only have budget for one. How do I find a person with the right skill set? What kind of background should they have? Steve, you want to add anything?
Yeah, this chart's really helpful when thinking about hiring and your strategy around the type of profile and persona that you're going to pursue. So for example, we did the CISO search for an investment bank in New York. It's a leaner team, leaner organization. That person came in and said, I'd really like to hire a director of architecture and engineering where I don't have anybody at a leadership level and I want them to build a team. We did that, and then that person said, I'm looking for an engineer, a senior engineer on my team. It's a bank, so they call it VP, but it's an individual contributor role. So I sat down with him and I pulled out this chart and I said, okay, this is what the market looks like. What pools are the most important? Point on this matrix, highlight the 3 or 4 boxes that you want us to pursue. What are the keywords that we should be hearing about in an interview, and where do you want the foundational skills to be? And this is really helpful because it shows, okay, if you're looking for somebody that has a combination of AppSec and or something technical like AppSec product security, oh, but I want them to do a bunch of GRC. That's not a huge part of the market. Those are 2 different tracks. So we know this intuitively, but to put these numbers out there and say, look, if you want that profile, there maybe a quarter of the market has it. So we just need to figure out what the right balance is.
Great. So now we're back here and we'll keep going. So let's talk a bit about retention. As we deal with resource tightness in the industry, we are seeing something of a crisis in staffing, as we've all heard across the conference this week. And what we have found is we ask staff a lot about what helps them feel satisfied and dissatisfied in the role, what makes them want to leave the role. And we found the 2 things that really move the needle most, not surprisingly, are my management makes me feel valued and supported. As you can see, if people actually genuinely feel that and say yes to that question, most of them are, or many of them are not actively considering a job change. It's the thing that will really drive that the most. And if they're satisfied with career development and upward mobility, again, now the majority are no longer looking to change jobs. So really leaning in on how do you make your folks really feel valued and feel like they have an opportunity. I'll also say the years 4 through 7 at your company are really the critical years there. The first 3 years, folks will kind of get by on the inertia of, hey, this is a new job, this is exciting, I feel like I'm growing into this new role. And then they hit a wall sometime around year 3. And if you can find a way to drive that progression and keep them around, once they get through year 7, they're often there very long term. So if you're really thinking about retaining folks, really leaning in on that kind of middle retention path, not that you got here, now you're up to speed, but that you're here, you're comfortable, what's next for you kind of retention management development plan becomes really critical. Want to add anything?
Well, there's one piece that's missing here that's really important too. It's compensation, right? Particularly at the individual contributor role. We see that many security engineers, it's viewed in the market as just, it's a commodified skill set. And so that's why we see a lot of 1-year, 2-year stints, is because people can double or triple their comp just by 2 moves or 3 moves in a span of 5 years. So that comes into play here just as much as anything else, if not even more so. So that has to be right before you even get to this point.
Yeah. Any final questions on the data before we go into final steps? Yep.
Do you have the percentage of who said yes and who said no?
Sorry, one more time.
Do you have like the percentage of who said yes and no to the question?
I couldn't quite hear the first half.
From a demographic standpoint, from what slice of?
Question, are you satisfied or not?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess some said yes and some said no. Do you have that data?
Yes.
Yes. It's just
Yes, we
buried in
do.
some other reports. We didn't want to go that deep here.
Yeah. So maybe we just kind of outline what. So our reports, these are high level graphics from those reports, but we drill down into a variety of different areas related to satisfaction, and we dive into backgrounds and foundational skills, and a whole bunch of other areas. They're really robust analytics reports with a good narrative arc around them, but just more graphics like you've seen.
Yes, I think we have about 10 minutes, right, for questions and go through next steps. So Steve, let's start working through next steps. And we've already talked about this a little bit. The importance of having shared risk ownership models. How do you recommend folks go about building the relationships and setting up a model to document the processes for evaluating risks and making sure folks understand the risk decisions so they can control scope creep?
Yeah, we didn't talk about documentation, but we really should, particularly in light of liability concerns. And I talk to CISOs all the time, and they're digging now more into D&O policies and cyber insurance policies. They're also asking for indemnification clauses in employment agreements and offer letters and things like this. We didn't see these things happening 3 years ago, 5 years ago. That's relatively new. But with regards to building cross-functional relationships, it's the soft skills and it's the informal lunches, coffees, water cooler conversations that will really take your brand and elevate it, and take the brand of security in your organization and continue to elevate it. So if you have a friend that works in a product group, or you have a friend that works in a completely different non-technical function, getting together in the cafeteria or having coffee and saying, gosh, you know, what do you think about this legislation, or what do you think about this or that topic? Their response, again, you can gauge their response to think about whether or not that person will be a champion and advocate for you when you're not in the room.
Yeah, and on that note, we're also seeing, as resources have gotten so tight, a growing move back towards security champion programs and getting folks outside of the business to either understand cyber well enough that they can contribute to those conversations and help their business partners, whether it's somebody in the help desk helping the rest of the help desk figure out when a cyber problem emerges, or even potentially cross-training folks from outside of cyber into cyber, because it's often easier to fill a role internally from a cross-hire because the organization's budget roughly stays the same. So you can often more easily get resources to transfer somebody across teams. Steve, any advice on how to really build out that kind of program?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's all about understanding what your priorities and goals are, and the communication upwards and downwards, and making sure that there's alignment there, right? And I think that that's the critical piece of just building a successful program and building a successful brand for yourself.
Yeah, and then Steve, why don't you talk a bit about really revisiting board messaging and up-leveling there?
Yeah, I mean, to the point earlier that there are maybe some guidelines coming out, or there are a lot of resources out there. But again, no two boards are exactly alike, and no two companies are exactly alike. So figuring out what's important to my board, why is it important to my board, and also what else are you hearing if you're in the meeting? What are other cross-functional leaders, how are they taking whatever functional program and strategies that they're deploying, how are they summarizing that to the board? So learn from your peers, and I think also find a mentor who's been doing this in the organization, somebody that you know in the organization has been reporting to the board for 3, 4, 5 years or multiple cycles, and asking them, hey, you know, this is my messaging, this is what I'm trying to get through. Can you take a look at my materials? Can we take 15 minutes? I just would love your perspective. And I think that most people would be willing to do that, and they can really help as well to say, oh gosh, you know, I know that this board member was just at an organization that got breached, and so you might want to talk about this or that. And I think that just they would maybe, people who have been in that boardroom and know the personalities may also be able to help you navigate through it, particularly if you're doing it for the first time.
Yeah, that mentorship note's really critical. We found that more than half of CISOs don't have any sort of mentor, and only about 35% of CISOs have a mentor from outside of tech. And I mean, let's be real, the board's really evaluating how the management team works together and that they're capable of solving problems effectively. So everyone else in the C-suite has an incentive to make sure that you're successful at the board, because if you're not looking good at the board, they're not looking good at the board. So finding those folks who can mentor you and help you figure out your board messaging and get that right and be aligned can be incredibly valuable. And Steve, can you talk a bit about
Before we do that, this doesn't have to be formal, by the way. I mean, this could be informal mentoring. This could just be somebody with whom you've had a relationship, and now you say to them, hey, you know, we've been friends, or we've been colleagues for a while. I could really use your help or perspective on these topics, and I think that most people would be happy to do that.
Yeah, and then can you round us out by talking a little bit about creating a professional development and hiring roadmap so that you can really figure out where you want your team to go over the next year, 2 years?
Yeah, be really aware of what's going on in the boardroom, the conversations that are being had at a strategic level for the business, not just security. Listen to those quarterly earnings calls if you're working for a publicly traded company, even if you're not in a leadership position. Just understand, okay, how do I think about the future as it relates to the growth of my organization? So being really aligned with whatever your task is, with the security task, and then married that to the business trajectory.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Steve. Folks, we have about 5 minutes left for questions. If anyone has anything they want us to answer, go ahead.
Do you have this
Yes. Yes, the question was on reporting structure. We find that I think we have that in our State of the CISO report, but is it 70%, I think, still report into
Yeah.
a tech function, either
So-
a CIO or CTO?
Every year, lots of people are curious about this, and it stays about the same. It's about 65% of folks report into a technology function, and 35% report into a business function. That number stayed in that 65, 35, 70, 30 split every year since we've been doing the study in 2020. And we see a wider variety of roles in who CISOs are reporting to. But what we've really generally seen anecdotally is who you report to isn't necessarily as important as one who you have dotted line connection to, and who's actually going to help you and support you within the organization. You don't necessarily want to report to the CEO and have the CEO be like, okay, checkbox, security's done, go do your thing. You want that mentor and that partner in the business to be the person you're really reporting to.
Yeah,
Wanna
we've
elaborate?
seen this work in all ways and seen it not work in all ways, so it really depends on the personalities, the organization, the culture, and a variety of other factors.
Anyone else?
I've been following this report for a while, so this is great to see again. Question I have is around the role of the CIO and how the growing role of the CISO is like Pac-Man consuming it, or are you seeing that division continue to be clearly demarcated? And I'll kind of give some premise why IT strategy going forward to support the business strategy has to have security. So there isn't an independence there for the CIO.
Yeah, we are very clearly seeing a convergence of IT and security. We have done multiple CISO/head of technology roles or CISO/CIO roles for billion-dollar organizations and smaller. At first, I figured, okay, well, it's a smaller organization, so that's why they're doing it. And then we did it for $2.5 billion portfolio company of a big private equity firm. And I thought, okay, this is something, this is real. So yeah, I mean, as the IT space becomes more commoditized, companies move more to the cloud, it's becoming less complex and less expensive in comparison to the security stack. So it will be interesting to see with the convergence of this, what typically happens is organizations, our clients are looking for somebody who has expertise in security and knows enough about IT to lead an IT director under them that's leading the commoditized piece of it, rather than the opposite, because it's really difficult to navigate the vendor universe and the threat environment and all of this if you've only come up through infrastructure or development.
Any other questions?
I didn't
So
follow.
I think the question was, are there any
Did you get that?
tools that we're seeing that are helping CISOs really cover a lot of ground within their programs in one place, essentially?
Well, I can't speak to any particular platforms, but what I will say, a trend that we're clearly seeing is that smaller technical organizations are being acquired and gobbled up by the large organizations, be it the FANG organizations or the Salesforces, Microsoft, Cisco's of the world, and then it's being solution sold back. So I think it's more of a one-stop shop. I don't know if that makes things easier for anybody or makes it more difficult, and it probably doesn't make it any less expensive, but it is consolidating a little bit. We have seen that over the last 12 months for sure.
And we're seeing a lot of worries trying to make a choice between point versus platform solutions, and a growing move towards, can we find a platform that can get us 80% of the way to what a point solution would do, and that's enough for us to get by for a year or two before we have to worry about upgrading, and our budgets hopefully will expand by then. That's definitely happening. Any other questions before we wrap? All right, seeing none, you can get a whole, thank you so much for joining today, by the way. It was great to have you all so early in the morning.